the horror of it all.
We grow up with a certain hunger, not only for the bright things in life, but for things that are fearful and terrifying.
The filmmaker puts something on the screen, and each individual member of the audience adds something unto themselves to complete the process.
You know, if you wonder why the continual preoccupation with horror in motion pictures, there's a reason. People love to be scared. He understood Stevenson's play. Stevenson mentioned that he was the personification of evil, but it was the evil of his expression, and it was not achieved by Barrymore with makeup. You know, the leading men are not remembered by the public. It's the heavies that are remembered, because they're the characters in plays and in motion pictures who are the active ones. The leading men are acted upon, but the heavies, the villains, are the ones who do things. That's why the great actors of, ever since Betterton, have preferred to play the heavies. Lou Tellegen was a leading man to Sarah Bernhardt for many years, and he came to the States, and I got to know him because we were both sculptors. He was an extremely handsome man with a magnificent physique, walked like a panther, had a cold gray eye that you could see a mile away. And he once said to me, "I love my men of sin."
The Phantom of the Opera.
The important element is that much of it takes place in the semi-darkness of catacombs. In a way, the Paris Opera House is a symbol of the unconscious mind in which dwells monstrous desire, and this struck a resonant chord in many of the masculine members of the audience. Chaney's performance, because he spent much of the time wearing a mask, was a matter of ballet. He was a master, a consummate master of pantomime. Phantom of the Opera didn't have any overt supernatural implications, but we had a man who slept in a coffin, who lived in catacombs 5 levels below the Paris Opera House, and who masked himself to disguise a hideous face. And in a way, he pressed the buttons of an audience that at that time was very unaware of the sexual symbolism involved, but it registered nonetheless, because in effect, the character of Chaney, as portrayed in The Phantom of the Opera, was that of a man who is ashamed or afraid of his own sexuality, who conceals his monstrous desire, as it was termed in those days, under a mask. When it is revealed, the heroine recoils in fright from a kindly, gentle man who is now revealed as a hideous being. The unique quality of the silent film in America was that it did not deal with supernatural topics per se. Actually, evil was personified by the ugly and the deformed, as in the case of Lon Chaney and the other actors, and it took place usually in an atmosphere of darkness. We knew, of course, that handsome people were almost invariably good, and that deformed, elderly, unfortunate people were bad. This we had learned in our fairy tales as children. Now we were seeing those fairy tales in darkness up there on the screen, without benefit of Freudian psychology, without benefit of special effects. The important thing is we believed what we saw, and it frightened the living blazes out of us.
Mr. Zucker, the head of Paramount, called me up and asked me if I would like to do a film of the famous Stevenson story, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I saw the story as a conflict between, not between good and evil, as it used to be done before, where Jekyll becomes an evil person, a monster. But I saw the story more as a conflict between the high aspiration of every human being and his lower, baser instincts. And that the whole idea was to have a young man, very handsome, whose whole intention is to free himself from all the evil impulses, all the animal impulses, really, not evil, animal. And the idea with Frederick March was that when he becomes Hyde, he does not become a monster, but he becomes our common ancestor, the Neanderthal man.
It's very interesting to compare these two films that were made almost at the same time in the early 30s, in that they both dealt with the theme of death. Dracula with an undead creature brought back to life, living off of the blood of the living, and the Frankenstein monster, a creature made from parts of dead bodies, and perhaps doubly terrifying for that reason. When I was much younger, I knew the late James Whale, and he told me a fascinating anecdote about the first sneak preview of Frankenstein, which was held in Santa Barbara. While he was sleeping in the middle of the night, he was awakened with a phone call, and a voice came on the line saying, "Are you the director of that film that was previewed tonight?" And he said, "Yes." And the voice said, "Well, I can't sleep, and I'll be damned if I'll let you sleep." And James found this story to be very amusing, and it was a characteristic of his horror films particularly, that they were always very much leavened with humor, because he felt, and I think rightly so, from a dramatic point of view and from the audience point of view, that it was very important to relieve the tension that was built in a horror film with humor along the way.
It was 1932, and James Whale had just finished Frankenstein, which was an enormous success, with Boris Karloff, who was the star of The Old Dark House 2. We had Charles Laughton in his first American film. We had Raymond Massey. We had Melvyn Douglas, and I was very impressed. Boris was as charming and gentle a person off-screen as he was horrendous and threatening on-screen. There was a great deal of thunder going and lightning and rain coming in and cobwebs and doors creaking. As a leading lady, it was my job to be very, very frightened. So Mr. Whale put me into a pale silk velvet bias-cut evening dress, very décolleté, and I asked him why, and he said, because when Boris is chasing you through the corridors, I want you to be like a flame going through the house and be very threatened, and that was my role, to be very threatened, very frightened, and to scream a lot. You know, actually, I think that putting me in pale pink silk velvet added to the feeling of fragility and helplessness that actresses needed in horror films, because if the beautiful young actress or lady is not threatened, there's no horror.
Makeup alone doesn't make the best monster. The best monster is one whom we, as members of the audience, can recognize through the makeup as having some of the qualities that are buried within ourselves. All of us got some kind of vicarious pleasure, I'm sure, out of watching King Kong go on a rampage and tear down the very symbols of New York City that represented wealth and power and prestige, which most of us were denied. Because most of us were very poor during the Depression. We paid a dime or 15 cents or 25 cents tops to see King Kong and the other monsters. Those of us who were adolescents got the same kind of satisfaction and gratification out of watching Frankenstein's monster, because he, in a way, was a very symbol of adolescence. Lumbering, inarticulate, ugly, unwanted in a society where age was deemed superior to youth. It's hard to believe that it's turned around, but it has.
I thought they would stop her defiling the image I created of her. Stop her degrading my work.
Bluebeard hangs in my memory, not only because I was the star of it, but because it had a depth of characterization, which in that period in Hollywood was not often seen on the screen.
Because when they became Jeanette, I could take out my fury on them. I couldn't kill one.
In the early days of Hollywood, pictures were in black and white. Black and white in more than one way, not only in the character of the film material, but in the plot lines. Everything was either black or white. There were no grays. The villains were just steeped in villainy, and the heroes were just too good to be true. Hollywood grew, and now we have human characters on the screen that have shades of evil and shades of good, and there are grays. It took a while for Hollywood to learn this.
When I first started making horror films, it was because I made a film called Crime of Passion, starring Barbara Stanwyck, Sterling Hayden, Raymond Burr. We got great reviews, and the picture opened up and died. and I want to know what happened. So I toured the country. I got out of Hollywood, and I saw what happened and what was happening. And that was the teenagers that were buying the records. It was the teenagers that were leaving the house, getting away from that TV box in the living room. The teenagers wanted to get away from the home. They wanted to get away from their parents. And they went to the cinema, they went to the theater, and they had fun with the horror picture because in my horror films, whether it was I was a teenage werewolf, I was a teenage Frankenstein, Blood of Dracula, the teenager they were always against the culprit that was the adult. And that's what the kids felt. And that's why they really had a good time. And they had fun with my pictures.
We had completed the picture over in England and had returned quite satisfied with the work we had done. And much to our chagrin, when we saw the picture, the producer had put into the picture a mechanical device which had been concocted by the special effects English people and made a real demon which you could see walking through the forest. Which was a tremendous shock to all of us because the Oliver Onion's story had ended with the remark, maybe it would be better not to know.
For me, Hammer was the beginning of a cult, the beginning of a new era, a new beginning of horror pictures. Hammer, I think, came out of the fact that perhaps on television they couldn't show a lot of blood. They weren't allowed to show that. They weren't allowed to show a lot of sexuality. There was no nudity on television. So perhaps Hammer came out of that taboo. And so I think a new color came, blood came, and a new sexuality, a new sensuality. Of course, because there was nudity. But there was also a sensuality connected to the dark side. And that's something I think that connected with people. The dark side. We all have it. I've never been offered the role of a sweet person. I think it has to do with the fact that perhaps they saw the dark side of me. And I do fit the traditional pictures of the dark woman, the evil lady. I think that's why moviegoers go to see these films. They want to get in touch with that evil side.
You might hold a little bit longer on the shot of his going under the table and then trim a little bit of the beginning of this shot here. I'd like to hold. Horror stories have been popular throughout all of history. I think there's a reason for that. The experiencing of horror through a motion picture or a story is a cathartic experience. Blend from the movement in the long shot to her coming into the over-shoulder shot. It's a way in which the person can work out and express certain problems within his unconscious mind. We all have had feelings of horror as a child. These feelings have generally been buried. They lay repressed or suppressed in the back of the mind. And when you go to see a horror film and you scream with the audience, you are easing some of the pressure. Now, at the same time, when you do scream, you will very often smile afterwards. Smile or laugh because you know to a certain extent you've been had by the filmmaker. You know that he has manipulated the tools of his craft in order to get the right emotion from you. These are some of the new techniques we're working with here at New World. In our prosthetics department, we're capable of doing almost anything.
I'm not an android.
This guy's got a close-up tomorrow, so...
John Beekler is one of the best men in the business, I think. He's the head of our department, and he's created the special effects, the prosthetics, for a number of our films.
Push it over, back to the left a little bit.
In each one of these things, what he's trying to do is to give the audience something to build upon from within themselves.
The brace is slipping.
Try to mime I'm not an android with his mouth.
I'm not an android. I am a human being.
It'll work.
But it's essential to remember that special effects are never an end unto themselves. Special effects are a means to lead the audience into a fuller understanding and appreciation of the film. The goal is not to dazzle the audience with the special effects, although it's nice if you can do that. The goal is to reach the unconscious of the audience and to let them experience, through special effects, emotions and visual sensations on film that cannot be achieved in any other way. When I was doing the Poe films years ago, we had to leave much to the audience's imagination, and I don't think that was necessarily bad. The audience should participate in the film-going process.
The tradition of the Grand Guignol theater, which goes back to the turn of the century and before in France, was always one of presenting gore on stage. I mean, showing it happen, people having their throats ripped open and having a hot burning iron placed on the side of their face or something like that, done with tremendous technical expertise. And this tradition, of course, has been carried over into the horror film.
The essence of enjoying a horror film is in the fact that you, as a spectator, are totally safe. You are secure. What's happening on the screen is not going to happen to you.
Some years ago, I wrote a novel called Psycho about a mass murder. And Alfred Hitchcock made it into a film very effectively, without using overt violence, merely suggesting it on the screen. But times have certainly changed. In the last 20 years, we have nothing but explicit violence in the so-called spatter films today.
The real horror today is not horror films, which are a lot of fun. Teenagers and adults love them because we never get rid of our fears of the dark and fears of the night. The real horror is on the streets today, in every city, in every town. It's on our television news.
If you see a body lying in the street and you've seen it on film as a child and as a young person and as a young adult and as a mature person, it's not a great shock, and it should be.
In recent times, that I think that it has become so excessive, and then it becomes a kind of pornography of blood for its own sake, and of course that does become distasteful.
It's necessary to call the halt somewhere along the line, I feel, and return to the prime virtues of the horror film, the wonder and the fantasy and terror that it evokes.
You can hand somebody a glass of milk, and if the music is right and the setting is right, the audience will jump and scream in the theater.
That the very fact that you don't know is what makes it fearful and makes it mystifying and shocking and can scare the devil out of you.
I was orphaned when I was 3 years old. My father died, and I was sent to an Episcopal orphanage in Peekskill, New York, run by the Episcopal Sisters of St. Mary. They were very sensible women. Lights went out when it was time to go to sleep, and they stayed out until the morning. So I never learned to be afraid of the dark.
My mother told me that I used to have a Halloween skeleton made out of paper in my room, and she was very amused because I loved that skeleton. It represented my fears. But she said that every night before I went to sleep, I would take that and put it outside my room and close the door so that I didn't have to have it with me in the dark.
I remember Mama saying every night, "Good night, children." My brother and I shared the same bedroom. "Good night, children. I'll leave the light on in the hall." And I must have equated that with dark not being good for me.
Dark and light, they exist together, they coexist, and they must be dealt into. The dark side must be.
And suddenly we heard these scratchy noises about behind the glass. My grandmother went and opened the curtain, and there, pressed against the glass, was this frightening face of this young woman with her nose flattened against the glass, her teeth scowling, and her nails going like this on the glass. Well, we're absolutely petrified with fear. I'll never forget how frightening that was. So my grandmother said, "Don't be afraid." And she opened the door, and I could see her as if it happened yesterday. She stood there, and she made this gesture to the girl, opened her embrace. And the girl, the insane girl, came right up to her, and she embraced her. The girl put her head against my grandmother's shoulder. You see, she said, "You must learn one thing, and that is that if you fill your heart with love, there'll be no room left in it for fear."
What you see now on the walls is an approximation of my devotion to the horror films of the 30s. These particular frames always remind me of the old theaters where people could go in and lose themselves into another world where people can live for 500 years on human blood, where fantasy reigns supreme. These ghoulies and ghosties and creatures that go bump in the night, the things that make you as a child whistle past the graveyard, these flickering images of cinema, thanks to Karloff, Lugosi, Chaney, Fay Wray in the clutches of King Kong, all the memories of our childhood, of the horror film, of vampires, these things are never going to die, because in the horror film, they are truly deathless, and so are we all.
In every horror film, there is a door, and behind that door lurks that which we fear the most. That which we fear in real life, something that lurks behind the closed door in our own mind. It's often the fear of death, the fear of pain. And yet that door must be opened. We must confront our own mortality, our own feeling of inadequacy. And in the best horror films, that door is opened for us. We glimpse the horror, are able to confront it, and walk away with the feeling that from then on we can live with the fear of death or the fear of suffering. We can understand it a little better, and in so doing, understand our own souls.